The last customer walked out at 4:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in November, and I remember the exact time because I had been watching the clock for 3 hours, willing it to slow down. After that, it was just me, the hum of the old refrigerator behind the counter, and 22 years of my life stacked in cardboard boxes. I didn't cry right away. I just stood there in the middle of the shop floor with a dish towel in my hands, staring at the menu board I had painted myself the first summer we opened. The letters were still crisp. I had repainted them every spring, every single year, because I believed that a shop that looked cared for would feel cared for to the people who walked through the door. That belief had kept me going longer than money had. The shop was called Birchwood Books Brew. It was mine, and then it wasn't, and the story of how that happened is the one I've been trying to figure out how to tell for a long time. I grew up in a small city in northern Ontario, the kind of place where everyone knows your family's last name and what your parents did for work. My mother taught elementary school for 31 years. My father ran a hardware store until his knees gave out. They were practical people who believed in showing up, doing the work, and not asking for more than you'd earned. Those values went into me the way water goes into wood. I opened Birchwood in the spring of 2001 when I was 27. I had saved for 4 years while working at a publishing house in Toronto, then decided I wanted to come home. Not because Toronto was bad, but because I missed the sound of the lake in the morning. I missed knowing my neighbors. I missed feeling like what I did each day had some connection to the people around me. The shop was a combination bookstore and café. Small, maybe 800 square feet on the main floor, with a loft that held the children's section and 2 reading chairs by a window that faced the street. I served drip coffee and loose-leaf tea, and, eventually, homemade butter tarts that became something people drove in for on Saturdays. It was never a gold mine. It was never supposed to be. It was supposed to be a place where people could breathe. For the first few years, I barely broke even. I refinanced twice. My mother lent me money she didn't say was a loan, but that I intended to repay anyway. I worked alone most days, opening at 7, closing at 6, eating my lunch standing at the counter because sitting down felt like giving something up. But the regulars came, and they brought friends, and eventually Birchwood became something the town talked about with a kind of quiet pride. In the summer of 2003, on a Thursday afternoon in late August, 2 boys came in off the street. They were maybe 12 or 13. Both of them in clothes that were too thin for the weather that day. It had turned cold the way it sometimes does in August in northern Ontario, that sharp reminder that summer is just borrowing time. One of them was taller, with a streak of mud on his jacket sleeve. The other had his hands shoved so far into his pockets that his shoulders were up around his ears. They stood just inside the door and didn't move, the way kids do when they want something but have been told too many times not to ask. I was shelving a box of new arrivals in the fiction section. I watched them for a moment without making it obvious I was watching. They weren't looking at the books. They were looking at the pastry case. I came around the counter and asked if they wanted something. The taller one shook his head very quickly, the reflex of someone who has practiced saying no. The shorter one looked at the floor. I said I had some butter tarts that hadn't sold today and that I'd have to throw them out if somebody didn't eat them. That was partially true. They'd sell tomorrow, but I wasn't thinking about tomorrow. I put 2 tarts on a plate and set them on the counter with 2 cups of hot chocolate, and I went back to my shelving. I didn't make a thing of it. I didn't watch them eat or ask them questions. After about 15 minutes, I heard the door open and glanced over, and the taller one paused and said, quietly, "Thanks, ma'am." Then they were gone. They came back the next week. And the week after, eventually it became a regular thing. Thursday afternoons, just before 4, they'd turn up and I'd find something for them. We started talking. Their names were Alistair and Jonah. They were best friends in the same grade, and they were both having years that were harder than years at 13 ought to be. Alistair's mother was sick. Jonah's home situation was something he mentioned only in careful pieces, never the whole picture. I didn't push. I just kept the kettle on. This went on for 2 years. By the time they were 15, they were coming in after school sometimes just to do homework at the corner table. I kept a few pens behind the counter for them. Once, when Jonah showed up with a bruise above his left eye and said he'd run into a door, I called the school's family support worker the next morning. I never told him I'd done that. The last time I saw them was a Sunday in October of 2005. Alistair told me they were moving. His family was going to his aunt's place in Sudbury. Jonah said he was going to his dad's in BC. He didn't seem happy about it. They both stood there at the counter for a while, not quite leaving. Before they walked out, Alistair took a folded napkin from his pocket. He had written on it in his careful, narrow handwriting. It said, "We'll pay you back someday. We promise." Then he set it on the counter next to my till, and they left. I kept that napkin in the drawer beneath the cash register for 19 years. I'm not sure why exactly. Maybe because it was the kind of thing you hold on to when the receipts and the invoices and the bank statements start to feel like the whole story of what you've built. It was proof of something that didn't show up anywhere on a balance sheet. For a long time, the shop was fine. More than fine. We grew slowly, the way good things do. I hired a part-time assistant, a woman named Beth, who knew every regular by their order and could find any book in our inventory in under a minute. I added an event series, local author readings on Friday nights, that became a real draw. We were reviewed in a provincial magazine in 2011. I framed the clipping, and then my sister came back. She's 3 years older than me. She left home when I was 20, moved out west, married a man I met twice, divorced him, moved to Calgary, moved back east. We had never been close, not even as children. She was the kind of person who moved through rooms, leaving a kind of disturbance in the air, not a bad energy exactly, but an unsettled one. As kids, I learned to read her moods the way you learn to read weather. She came back to our city in 2015. Our mother was in her late 70s by then, still sharp but slowing down, and my sister arrived with a suitcase and a lot of energy about how she was home to help. She moved into our mother's house. She made herself indispensable in the way that people who are very good at appearing helpful do. At first, I was glad she was there. I was running the shop full-time, and I worried about our mother being alone. Having someone in the house seemed like a relief. But things shifted in ways that were hard to name at first. She started coming into the shop. Not often, but regularly enough that the staff noticed. She'd bring our mother sometimes, and that was fine. That was lovely. But she also started asking questions about the lease, about my margins, about whether I'd ever thought about selling. She framed it as curiosity. She framed it as looking out for me. She said things like, "It must be so hard to sustain this kind of business long term," and "Have you thought about what you'd do if something happened?" I told her things were fine, because they were at the time. In 2017, my mother had a mild stroke. She recovered, but it shook all of us, and in the aftermath, my sister stepped further into the center of things. She became the one who managed our mother's appointments, her medications, her finances, with my mother's full consent, and with a power of attorney that my mother had signed and that I hadn't known about until it was already done. I want to be careful here because I don't know everything, and I never will. What I know is that over the following 3 years, things went wrong in ways I couldn't track. The money my mother had set aside, savings she had built over decades on a teacher's salary, money she had mentioned to me as something she intended to leave for both of us, became something that wasn't there when I looked for it. My sister had explanations. The explanations were always just complicated enough to feel possible. I should have pushed harder. I didn't. I was working 60-hour weeks, and I trusted that there were limits, that family had limits, that she wouldn't. In 2019, I found out that my sister had approached my landlord, without telling me, without my knowledge, and had made inquiries about taking over the commercial lease on my shop. The landlord told me himself, almost apologetically, during a routine renewal conversation. He said, "Tu sais, I knew. I didn't know." There was a conversation with my sister after that I don't fully want to relive. She said she had been exploring options, that she was just thinking about the future, that I was being paranoid. She cried. I went home and sat in my car in front of my building for 40 minutes. After that, things got worse in ways that accelerated. She told certain people in town things about the shop's financial situation that weren't accurate. I don't know how she got the numbers she had, because some of them were close enough to the real ones to have come from somewhere. She told people I was struggling, that I was thinking of closing, that it was sad but inevitable. Two of my corporate account holders, local businesses that had standing orders with us, canceled within the same month, citing uncertainty. One of them later told me, uncomfortably, that they'd heard through a mutual contact that we were winding down. We were not winding down, but we were starting to. There is a thing that happens when a story about your business gets into the air of a small city. It moves the way smoke moves, quietly, without clear direction, until suddenly it's everywhere and you can smell it on everything. People started coming in less. Not dramatically, not overnight, but the numbers changed. Beth noticed it before I said anything. She mentioned it gently one morning while we were doing inventory, and I told her I was aware. In 2021, my landlord sold the building. The new owner offered me a lease renewal at a rate that was, by any reasonable measure, unsustainable. I tried to negotiate. I hired a commercial lease consultant, which cost me money I didn't easily have. We got a modest reduction, but not enough. I had 2 years left on my reserve, and I knew it. I didn't tell my mother any of this. She was 83 by then, and fragile in new ways, and what was happening wasn't something she could fix or needed to carry. By the autumn of 2023, I had accepted what was coming. I had about 4 months of operational runway. I was going to have to close by the end of the year, and there was no version of the numbers that changed that. I gave Beth as much notice as I could, and she was gracious about it in a way that made me feel worse. I started sorting through inventory. I reached out to a few other independent booksellers about acquiring our remaining stock at fair prices. I told myself that 22 years was a good run. I told myself that the shop had mattered to people, that it had done real things, that closing wasn't failure. I told myself these things often enough that some days I almost believed them. The last week was a blur of small ceremonies. Regulars came in to say goodbye. Some of them brought flowers. One woman, who had been coming every Saturday morning for 11 years, brought a card signed by what looked like her entire family. A retired teacher told me, quietly, while I was wrapping her books, that her son had learned to love reading in our children's loft, and that she wanted me to know that. I held it together through most of those conversations, not all of them. The last day was a Tuesday. I had chosen to close on a Tuesday deliberately. I didn't want a weekend, didn't want a crowd, didn't want it to feel like a performance. I just wanted it to be quiet. A few people came in throughout the day. By late afternoon, it was just me. I was wiping down the espresso machine when I heard the door. I assumed it was someone who hadn't gotten the news, someone coming in for their usual order. I called out that we were in our last hour, that I still had some items available. Then I turned around. 2 men were standing just inside the door. They were in their mid-30s, both in good coats, and one of them was carrying a leather briefcase. Beside them was a woman in a dark blazer whom I didn't know, and she had the particular kind of stillness that I have since come to associate with lawyers. I didn't recognize them right away. It had been 19 years. People change enormously between 13 and 34. But then the taller one, the one without the briefcase, looked at me and smiled in a specific way, and something in my chest moved before my brain caught up. He said, "Hi. We used to come in on Thursday afternoons." I sat down on the stool behind the counter. I didn't plan to. My legs just made the decision without asking me. Alistair spoke first. He was the taller one, and he had his same careful way of choosing words. He told me that he had gone to Sudbury with his family, that his mother had eventually recovered, that he had studied engineering at Waterloo, that he now worked in infrastructure in Ottawa. He said he had thought about the shop many times over the years. He said he had tried to find us online and discovered what was happening. Then Jonas spoke. He was the same person, quieter, eyes that took everything in before he said anything. He had gone to BC, he said, and it had been hard for a while, and then it had gotten better, slowly. He had studied business at UBC. He now ran a small investment firm in Vancouver that worked primarily with community-based businesses. He said he had been in contact with Alistair for the past few months. The woman in the blazer was their lawyer. Her name was Ms. Park, and she handled the next part with the efficiency of someone who had done this before, though I suspect she had not done exactly this. They had, together, put forward an offer. Not to save the shop in the form it existed in. They were clear about that. They weren't trying to override what I had decided. The offer was to purchase the building. Alistair explained that they had spoken to the current owner, had made an inquiry, had found him open to selling at a number they were able to reach. They proposed to set up a long-term lease for me at a rate structured to be genuinely sustainable, tied to revenue rather than flat market rates. The building would be held by a small property trust they had created together. They had also, Miss Park added, engaged an accountant to review the financial activity related to my mother's estate, and they had some questions about certain transactions that they believed warranted further attention. I didn't say anything for a long time. Then I said, "Do you still have that napkin? The one you left on the counter?" Alistair reached into the inside pocket of his coat and took out a small, clear envelope. Inside, it was a folded napkin, soft with age. He set it on the counter in front of me. I don't know how long I cried. Not an embarrassing amount of time. Some amount of time. What happened after that moved in stages, the way real things do, without the neatness of a single resolution. Miss Spurnazelt. Park referred the matter of my mother's finances to a forensic accountant who identified a pattern of transfers over 4 years that totaled something in the range of $260,000. My sister retained her own lawyer. There were proceedings. I am not going to detail them here because some of it is still unresolved and some of it is my mother's story as much as mine. What I will say is that my mother, when I finally told her carefully with help from a social worker who specialized in elder financial abuse, looked at me for a very long time and then took my hand. She didn't say much, but she asked to come to the shop, and we went on a Wednesday afternoon, and she sat in the armchair by the front window for 2 hours with a cup of tea, and she told me she was glad it was still there. That mattered more than I expected it to. Birchwood Books Brew reopened the following March. We kept the same name, the same menu board that I had repainted every spring for 22 years, the same butter tart recipe. I hired Beth back. We added 2 more staff members. We started a literacy program for kids in grades 3 through 6 in partnership with the local library. Thursday afternoons 4 to 6, because I thought that was the right day. Alistair came to the reopening. He brought his wife and their daughter, who was 4, and immediately fell in love with the children's loft. Jonah flew in from Vancouver, which I hadn't expected. He stood in the corner for most of the evening with a coffee, watching people move through the space, and when I went over to him and asked what he was thinking, he said, "I'm thinking it looks the way it always did." I told him I still had the napkin. He said he knew. He'd kept the drawer receipt from the first time he'd ever paid for something himself, a used paperback he bought the last Thursday before he left for BC. He said he'd been in grade 9, and it was a novel about a man who builds a boat, and he had read it 4 times. I didn't know he bought that book. I had no idea, but somehow that detail, that small specific detail, felt like the whole story in miniature. 2 kids who came in hungry on a cold Thursday and were given something without being asked anything in return. And what they carried out the door, beyond the butter tarts and the hot chocolate, was the idea that a place could be like that people could be like that. That idea, it turned out, had enough weight to last 20 years and cross a country. The napkin is framed now on the wall behind the register. A lot of people ask about it. I tell them it's a receipt for a debt that was never mine to collect, paid by people who didn't owe me anything, and that I consider it the most valuable thing in the building. I still repaint the menu board every spring. Some things you keep doing, not because they're necessary, but because they remind you of who you decided to be.